4 months. That's all that separates us from one of the most consequential midterm elections in recent memory. And I'm going to be honest with you, this map looks nothing like it did at the start of this cycle. Candidates have entered races nobody expected them to enter. Incumbents who looked untouchable are suddenly fighting for their political lives. And a handful of states that seemed like foregone conclusions have turned into genuine battlegrounds. So today we're going through every single Senate race on the November ballot, all 35 of them. And by the time we're done, you're going to have a very clear picture of what the Senate is going to look like for the second half of Donald Trump's presidency, and why the fight for the majority is far closer than Republicans want to admit. Let's start with the foundation, the states nobody's seriously contesting. On the Republican side, the safe column is exactly what you'd expect. Idaho, Montana, Wyoming, South Dakota, Oklahoma, Arkansas, Louisiana, Alabama, Tennessee, Kentucky, and West Virginia. These states are so deeply conservative at this point that Republicans could practically run an absent campaign and still win comfortably. Double-digit margins, reliable turnout, and no Democratic infrastructure capable of mounting a real challenge. These races are done before they start. Democrats have their own version of that stability. Oregon, Illinois, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, New Jersey, and Delaware all stay firmly blue. The combination of urban population density, strong party infrastructure, and long-term demographic trends means Republicans aren't spending meaningful money or time in any of these states. Lock them in, move on. With those safe seats settled, Republicans hold a 42-40 early advantage on the board. Now we move into the likely column, races that are going to be decided somewhere between 5 and 15 points. More competitive, but the outcome is still fairly clear. Florida is the first one worth discussing on the Republican side. Ashley Moody is running to serve out the remaining 2 years of Marco Rubio's term, a term he won by 16 points in 2022. This race will be closer than that. The current polling average has Moody ahead by just under 5 points. But here's the thing. Florida polling has a well-documented habit of overstating Democratic support. In 2024, at least one major pollster had Kamala Harris winning the state. She didn't just lose, she lost by more than 10 points. Trump carried Florida by 13 points that same night. So while the polls make this look tighter than it probably is, Moody is still very likely to win. Florida goes likely Republican. South Carolina lands in the same column, but for a slightly different reason. Lindsey Graham is seeking a 5th term, and he is, by most measures, one of the most unpopular senators in the country. The polling has him ahead by only about 7 points compared to Trump's 17-point margin in the state in 2024. That's a dramatic underperformance. But even running significantly below the top of the ticket, Graham still wins. Expect him to take it by somewhere between 8 and 10 points, likely red. By the way, please leave your questions or comments in the comments section. I will answer each one individually as time permits. Also, I would be very happy if you liked the video and subscribed to my channel. Now let's continue. Mississippi follows the same pattern. Cindy Hyde-Smith is another GOP incumbent with an approval rating that doesn't quite match her state's partisan lean. Polling has her up by about 8.7 points, but she should still clear double digits when the votes are counted, likely Republican. On the Democratic side, Virginia stays likely blue. Mark Warner is running for a 4th term with decades of statewide experience and a genuine reputation for bipartisan appeal that few senators can match. His likely Republican opponent isn't well known to most Virginia voters yet, and that gap in name recognition matters. Democrats continue to benefit from dominant margins in Northern Virginia, Richmond, and Hampton Roads. Warner wins, but probably not by the 20-point gap polling currently suggests. Likely Democratic. Iowa is the most interesting likely race on the board right now because it's actually been tightening. Republican Ashley Hinson is the favorite to fill Joni Ernst's seat, but her lead over Democrat Josh Turek has collapsed from nearly double digits just a month ago down to under 3 points today. A big part of that is the genuinely competitive governor's race happening simultaneously, which is drawing energy and resources to the Democratic side of the ballot. But here's the context that matters. Trump won Iowa by 13 points in 2024. Iowa polling has a well-established track record of inflating Democratic numbers. Hinson should still win this by 5 to 7 points when everything is counted. Likely Republican. Minnesota flips that script. Lieutenant Governor Peggy Flanagan is the expected Democratic nominee, with Republicans likely nominating Michelle Fischbach. Polling suggests a competitive race, but no Republican has won a presidential election in Minnesota since 1972, and no Republican has won a Senate race there in over 2 decades. Democrats hold a clear structural edge here. Flanagan is the favorite, likely blue. Nebraska gets its own separate category, and it deserves one. Independent Dan Osborne is back, and he's not just making up the numbers. He came within 7 points of knocking off Republican incumbent Deb Fischer in 2024, an extraordinarily impressive run for an independent with no major party backing. Now he's taking on Pete Ricketts, who is polling only about 4.7 points ahead, despite being the sitting senator. The market odds give Ricketts roughly a 67% chance of winning, which is not the kind of number that inspires confidence. Osborne has built his campaign around economic frustration and labor issues rather than partisan identity, and that approach attracts voters from both parties. Nebraska is still a lean Republican state at its core. Trump won it by 20 points in 2024, but Osborne's presence makes this race genuinely unpredictable. More importantly, Osborne has made clear he would remain an independent and not formally caucus with either party. Nebraska sits in its own independent category and is excluded from either party's seat count. Kansas also lands in the likely Republican column, but it's not as comfortable as it used to be. Roger Marshall leads Democrat Adam Hamilton, a well-known Kansas City pastor who initially explored an independent run, by about 8 points in the only poll released so far. Marshall only won by 10 points back in 2020, so this isn't a dramatic underperformance, but Hamilton is a legitimately strong candidate, and I wouldn't be surprised to see this come down to single digits. Still Republican, but worth monitoring, Colorado and New Mexico round out the likely Democratic column. John Hickenlooper and Ben Ray Lujan are both running for second terms, and both should win by roughly 10 to 15 points. No drama here. With all the likely and solid states now on the board, Republicans lead 48 to 44. That leaves 8 states still in play, and these 8 races are going to determine who controls the Senate for the next 2 years. Let's get into the lean states. Texas is the one everybody's been watching, and for good reason. State Representative James Tallarico won the Democratic nomination. Meanwhile, incumbent John Cornyn was forced into a runoff and ultimately knocked out by Attorney General Ken Paxton, a result that genuinely alarmed Republican leadership, and for good reason. Paxton carries a staggering amount of baggage: securities fraud allegations, affairs, a bribery charge that triggered an actual impeachment vote from the Republican-controlled State House. He is a significantly weaker general election candidate than Cornyn would have been, and the numbers reflect that. Paxton leads by only about 1.7 points in the polling average, and the market odds put his win probability at roughly 60%, barely above a coin flip. Democrats are going to pour enormous amounts of money into this race. Tallarico is a sharp, energetic candidate who has attracted serious national attention. But Texas hasn't elected a Democrat to the Senate in decades, and Republicans have a consistent history of outperforming their polls on Election Day in that state. For me to genuinely believe Tallarico can win this, I'd need to see him leading consistently by several points, not half a point. For now, Texas leans Republican, but this is a real race. Maine might be the most dramatic story of this entire cycle, and it has nothing to do with Susan Collins. Democratic nominee Graham Plattner's campaign has effectively collapsed under the weight of sexual harassment allegations and, more recently, sexual assault accusations. He is still technically in the race as of right now, but he will almost certainly have to step aside. The deadline for Democrats to replace him is July 13th, and that date is coming fast. If he stays in, Collins wins in a landslide. If Democrats replace him, it's still not guaranteed that the new nominee closes the gap. Remember what happened when Democrats swapped out Joe Biden for Kamala Harris late in the 2024 cycle? That didn't exactly produce the result they were hoping for. The underlying map still favors Democrats. Kamala Harris won Maine by nearly 7 points in 2024, and the state has been drifting blue for years. But Collins has a unique ability to survive elections that should mathematically eliminate her. She's done it before, including in 2020 when every poll had her losing. Recent polling taken before the assault allegations became public already had Collins ahead by half a point. Maine leans Republican right now, but the situation is genuinely fluid. New Hampshire leans Democratic, and while it's competitive, Chris Pappas has a real advantage. He's running to replace the retiring Jeanne Shaheen and currently leads former Governor Chris Sununu, a very strong Republican candidate, by just over 5 points. But Sununu is the kind of name that closes gaps. New Hampshire is not allergic to Republican candidates. The state has had a GOP governor for the better part of the last decade. This one will be decided by a narrow margin, but Pappas is the slight favorite. Lean Democratic. Ohio is one of the most compelling cases for why candidate quality still matters in an era of pure nationalized politics. Sherrod Brown is back, trying to reclaim the Senate seat he lost in 2024, and his presence alone transforms this race entirely. Brown spent decades building a political brand around union households, working-class voters, and independents who split tickets, and that brand still carries weight in Ohio, even as the state has drifted firmly to the right. Trump won Ohio by 11 points in 2024, his largest margin across all 3 of his presidential runs. Republican incumbent John Husted has led in virtually every poll over the past year. But Brown's personal brand is so distinct from generic Democratic Party politics that he consistently outperforms where any other Democrat would fall flat. If almost any other Democrat were the nominee, Ohio would probably be comfortably Republican. With Brown on the ballot, it's genuinely competitive. I give Democrats the very narrowest of edges here, but this race will almost certainly be decided in single digits. Lean Democratic. North Carolina is, by almost any measure, the most likely flip on the entire board. Roy Cooper, former 2-term governor, one of the most recognizable political figures in the state, entered the moment Thom Tillis announced his retirement, and he immediately changed the entire character of the race. He left office with strong approval ratings, commands one of the most formidable fundraising operations in the country, $26 million raised compared to Republican Michael Whatley's $8 million, and he's led consistently in polls by nearly 8 points. Whatley is not a bad candidate, and he has Trump's endorsement, but he has never run for office before, and that inexperience at this level of competition is hard to hide. The catch is that North Carolina did vote for Trump in all 3 of his presidential runs, including 2024, when he won by over 3 points. Cooper's margin won't be 8 points on election night. This state is simply too competitive for that. But Cooper's personal brand is different from generic Democratic politics in a way that gives him a genuine edge. Lean Democratic. Georgia brings us Jon Ossoff, running for a second term after his narrow 2021 runoff victory and simultaneously ascending the 2028 presidential speculation rankings. He's been shattering fundraising records and has built one of the most sophisticated statewide organizations in the country. Current polling has him up about 6 points over Republican Mike Collins, but Georgia voted for Trump in 2024, and these numbers likely overstate the Democratic margin. Collins has strong conservative support and Trump's backing, but he's not considered a particularly formidable general election candidate for a race of this magnitude. Ossoff has the incumbency advantage, the financial edge, and an established ground game, but this state is never easy for Democrats. Recreating the high turnout Metro Atlanta coalition that has driven recent Democratic wins is a challenge every single cycle. Ossoff is the slight favorite, lean Democratic. That brings us to the 2 tightest races on the entire board, the 2 that could genuinely go either way. Alaska first. Dan Sullivan is the 2-term Republican incumbent, but he is currently the 3rd most unpopular senator in America. Mary Peltola is one of the strongest Democratic challengers anywhere in the country. She's already proven she can win statewide under Alaska's ranked choice voting system by building a coalition that pulls in independents, Alaska Native communities, and moderate Republicans who are willing to cross party lines. She has led Sullivan in every poll going back to last October. But there's important context. No Republican has won Alaska by fewer than 10 points in over 2 decades. Trump carried the state by 13 points in 2024. And Peltola herself just lost her own re-election bid in 2024. She's not invincible. The most recent weighted polling average has Sullivan narrowly ahead by under a point. One projection gives Democrats a 60% edge, another puts Sullivan as the slight favorite. The honest answer is that this is as close to a pure toss-up as a Senate race gets. One projection places it tilt Democratic by the narrowest possible margin. Another places it tilt Republican for the same reason. What's undeniable is that Alaska could genuinely decide which party controls the Senate, and because of ranked choice voting, we might not know the result for a week after election night. Michigan is the other one. Gary Peters' retirement opened up a seat that both parties immediately identified as a top priority. Republicans are running Mike Rogers, the the former congressman who lost Michigan's other Senate seat by fewer than 20,000 votes in 2024, despite being down by roughly 5 points in every poll going into Election Day. He significantly outperformed his numbers that cycle, and he enters 2026 in an even stronger position. Democrats, meanwhile, look headed toward nominating Abdul El-Sayed, who most analysts consider the least electable of the three major names in contention. Polls show Rogers performing almost 2 points better against El-Sayed than against alternative Democratic candidates. The current polling average has El-Sayed ahead by just 0.4 points, a margin so small it's essentially meaningless. Michigan is genuinely 50-50. Trump narrowly carried it in 2024, but Democrats have consistently won statewide races there. If Democrats consolidate their suburban coalition and turnout stays high, they hold this seat. If Republicans capitalize on the state's rightward drift at the presidential level, this is one of their biggest pickup opportunities of the cycle. One projection places Michigan tilt blue by the absolute slimmest margin. Another places it tilt red, citing Rogers' demonstrated ability to overperform his polls. Either way, this is the race to watch on election night. So here's where the map lands. Republicans hold their core states. Democrats flip North Carolina and Ohio. Georgia, Minnesota, and Maine's final outcome depends on whether Plattner steps aside in time. Michigan and Alaska go down to the wire. And Nebraska remains its own separate story entirely. The two clearest projections that emerge from this map, one gives Republicans 53 seats and Democrats 47, with the GOP maintaining control. The other gives Democrats 52 seats, Republicans 47, and Dan Osborne 1 seat as an independent, which would hand Democrats the majority. The difference between those two outcomes, Michigan, Alaska, and possibly Maine's next 72 hours, this Senate majority is genuinely up for grabs, and we are 4 months away. Drop your prediction in the comments. I want to know which race you think ends up being the one that decides the whole thing. If you're enjoying this kind of analysis as the map keeps evolving, subscribe and stay close, because this cycle is nowhere near done surprising us. I'll see you in the next one.